Welcome to the JCPS series on secondary school multi-tiered systems of support for behavior. The focus of this module is on how student intervention teams prepare for and implement progress monitoring for behavior. Progress monitoring is the term we use to describe the processes of assessing student progress in meeting their specific goals and evaluating the effectiveness of intervention. While progress monitoring is a legal requirement for students on an individualized education program, or IEP, it is also considered best practice for any student receiving interventions at Tiers 2 or 3. Logically, if we're concerned enough to identify a student as at risk and develop an intervention, whether it be small group instruction or a more individualized behavior plan, we should be equally as concerned with the progress. Progress monitoring is continuous, something we measure very regularly. In fact, progress monitoring for behavior may involve collecting data every day. What is collected, how it is collected, and how often it is collected is dependent upon the student, the nature of his or her challenges, and the scope of the intervention. For example, one student has had several major outbursts this year, and the student intervention team worked with the counselor to have them attend small group instruction focused on emotional regulation and anger control. Whether they are improving with regard to their emotional regulation is not something we can measure every day. However, we can provide their teachers with definitions of positive and negative behavior and check in weekly for reports. In contrast, another student has been engaging in disruptive behaviors in the classroom. Several times per day, they make rude comments or yell out loudly in multiple classes. In response, the student intervention team has developed a contract with them, under which they need to reduce the number of such disruptions by half in order to earn privileges. Because this student's behavior is so frequent, to simply check in with teachers once a week is unlikely to provide sufficient information. Instead, teachers will need to actually count how many disruptions they have on a daily basis. Progress monitoring with academics might be accomplished by administering what we call permanent products assessment. These include tests, assignments, and other work that can be kept as evidence. Although it might be possible to have a permanent product such as broken pencils or torn papers, progress monitoring with behavior generally requires actual observations of behavior. We have to see it and record it in some manner. Behavior assessment requires attention to dimensions such as frequency, or how often, duration, or how long it lasts, and latency, or how long it takes for something to start after a prompt. These are all fairly common, and we can measure with a simple tally or a timer. Importantly, while oversight of progress monitoring is the job of the student intervention team, the actual collection of data is done by teachers and others with whom the students interact on a daily basis. Even with these simple methods, it is often challenging for teachers to find the time or remember to collect data. The student intervention team can make this easier by helping teachers to consider tricks for data collection.
We know that collecting data for teachers can be very cumbersome, especially in a classroom full of tons of other kids. So we try to help find the easiest way for them to collect data so that we could get an accurate picture of what might be going on in the classroom.
For example, one easy way to collect tally data is to fill a pocket with paper clips. Every time the student engages in target behavior, one paper clip is moved to another pocket. Teachers can do this while standing in front of a class, and students will never notice the counting strategy. Another low-tech but very effective tally strategy is to put a piece of masking tape on an inner forearm. When the target behavior is observed, the teacher can suddenly make a tally on the tape. If students ask what the tape is for, teachers can always just say they're keeping track of something and leave it at that. When measuring duration or latency, a phone, tablet, or watch are always easy ways to record. Most of these devices have a timer application that can be easily tapped to start and stop. One must simply start the timer when the behavior begins and stop it when behavior ends. That time can then be recorded on a paper or directly on the device. When done, episodes can be added together for a total duration or be averaged to get an index of the average duration. Watch the team talk this through with a teacher who is preparing to collect data on student behavior.
Thanks for coming again, Miss Watkins. As you know, we've been talking a little bit more about Jackie and how she does struggle to start work when the bell rings, like when she transitions back into class.
Right, and I know that we have an intervention starting next week that'll hopefully start decreasing her time to when she'll start working. But, when the bell rings, but I'm just not sure how quick is quick enough.
Well, a good strategy would to be time the students that do this appropriately, and then that would be a reasonable goal for her.
All right, well, I can understand that, but I don't time anybody. I'm just trying to see how can I get her to start within 15 seconds of the bell.
Exactly, and that's why we need to start talking about measuring latency for Jackie as soon as the bell rings and then when she starts working. And we'll use the class average of 15 seconds for a good initial goal for Jackie.
Okay. I can't see that I have time to time the kids all day.
And I hear what you're saying, and you don't have to do this all day, just at those specific times when she's entering the classroom and when the bell rings.
And I was going to say, you don't have to time out the kids, just Jackie.
Okay, but I'm still not sure. How am I going to pull this off?
Well, we've got some ideas for you on that. Like, do you carry on a tablet? A tablet has a timer app on it.
No, I don't carry around a tablet, but I do have my cell phone in my pocket.
So all you would need to do is get your phone ready, like right before the bell rings when you're about to prompt them and remind them to start working, and start the timer as soon as the bell rings.
Okay, and then push stop once she actually starts working?
Exactly, and then that data is written down in a log, and we'll be able to have that progress monitoring to determine if she's improving and even if our intervention's working.
Another very common measure is concerned with how often a behavior occurs under specific circumstances. We'll call this opportunity-driven data. For example, we're interested in knowing how often this student is able to wait for the teacher to point to them before blurting out answers in class. The teacher is concerned because this student's outburst make it difficult to engage other students. On the first day, the teacher posed 6 questions, and the student waited to be called upon 3 times. The next day, the teacher posed 3 questions, and the student waited to be called upon twice. If we just look at the frequency, their hand raising went from 3 to 2, and it looks like it's going down. But the teacher provided different numbers of opportunities for waiting on these 2 days. On day 1, they raised their hand 3 of 6, or 50% of opportunities, and on day 2, they raised their hand 2 of 3, or 67% of opportunities. Many of the behaviors of interest for students are opportunity-driven, like the student's hand raising, and thus must be measured as a percent of opportunities in which they occurred. Behaviors such as appropriate responses to criticism, handling conflict peacefully, and saying please when asking a question are all opportunity-driven behaviors. They will require criticism, conflict, or a question needing to be asked before data on behavior could be collected. A simple way to collect opportunity-driven data is to count both the opportunity and the presence or absence of a behavior. As a simple tally, this can be done with 2 symbols. One that designates an opportunity and another indicating that the behavior was appropriate. This data says that the teacher asked 7 group questions on January 9th and that the student raised their hand 5 times. We could then say that they raised their hand during 5 divided by 7, or 71% of opportunities. So they continue to improve. Let's watch how the team introduces this concept to a teacher who will be collecting this type of data.
All right, so next up we have Tara, and her teacher, Miss Cowens, is here, so welcome.
Hey, thanks. I'm really hoping that the plan we have works. Tara's behaviors are really taxing on me right now.
Yeah, so just to review, Miss Cowens is concerned because Tara is having some trouble when she's given feedback or criticism. It's really a struggle for her in class.
And it's not like we see these behaviors happening all day, but if I do give her negative feedback in any sort of way or fashion, she yells or just blows up at me.
So what is it that you're wanting her to do?
Well, we have talked about these expectations before, and I know that she talks to the counselor, but I ask that she has a calm voice and that she just expresses herself to me. But she has a tendency to yell at others and start arguments.
So what we would need to know is how she responds typically when you do give her this feedback.
So thinking about it, I guess I can use tally marks to see how many times she argues and how many times she yells.
Yeah, sure. But if she's not giving any negative feedback, then there's nothing for us to see. And we don't want to just make up negative feedback. We want to know how she's responding when you do give her legitimate negative feedback.
Okay, so how could I do that?
It can still be as simple as a tally. You would just have to tally both the negative feedback and her response.
Yeah, so you can make a mark, let's say a 0, and to indicate that you gave her negative feedback. If she responds the way that you have taught her to, you can just mark out that 0. But if she doesn't respond the way that you have taught her to, the 0 stays there.
Now that's easy enough. I guess I would just ask her some clarification on why we're looking at all this.
It's because we need to account for all the opportunities. If she's not raising her voice and, arguing with you, then we would say 0. But what if there was no negative feedback given? We need to be able to count how often she raises her voice and argues with you when she is given that feedback.
Yeah, and like Chris was saying, I can show you what that would look like. You could just take a piece of tape and put it on your forearm, and every time you need to give her negative feedback, you would just place a 0. And then if she handles it appropriately, you would just slash out the 0. If she does not handle it appropriately or the way that you've taught her to, you would just leave the 0 standing. At the end of the day, you would have a percentage of those instances of negative feedback and how she responded, appropriate or not.
Okay, so that's really a reliable way to measure and track progress.
Yeah, exactly.
So far, everything we've described is a direct measure. That is, when a behavior is observed, we immediately record it with a tally or a start/stop of the watch. This type of data tends to be a very accurate representation of student behavior, but it can also be very time-consuming, requiring the observer to constantly monitor behavior. Another strategy for collecting behavioral progress monitoring data is to note whether a behavior occurred or did not occur during a period of time. In this method, called time sampling, it's the timer rather than the behavior that tells us to record. Using these time-based methods, we simply define an interval. Let's say a 40-minute class period. Then we record whether behavior occurred during that interval. Of course, the shorter the interval, the more accurate the data. Intervals can be longer with low-rate behaviors, those behaviors that don't occur that often, and we can use something called partial interval recording. With this method, the teacher records a plus if the behavior happened at any time during that interval, even if only once and briefly. Let's watch the student intervention team thinking this through with 3 teachers.
Thank you all for helping us try to figure out how to track Michael's wandering around. But honestly, we've talked about it and we can't really imagine having to track all of his in-seat and out-of-seat behavior.
Yes, I have Michael in science lab, and it's very difficult while wandering the classroom to monitor his behavior.
Yeah, same with me. I have him 4th period, and I'm totally occupied with teaching.
I can imagine that would be very overwhelming, even if he's not out of his seat that often.
Right, he's not out of his seat all the time, but when he is, it can last a long time.
So we're going to try and show you a measurement strategy that you can use so that you're not having to time him all the time. You would just need a countdown timer or a timer that'll have regular intervals on it.
Right, so I do this a lot. I just use my phone. I use my timer app. I set, say 5 minutes on my app. I press start, and then it'll buzz when it's done, and then that's when I record my data.
Yeah, you just go about your teaching, and if you see Michael out of his seat at any times, you just put a little plus sign for that interval.
You keep doing that for every 5 minutes during in-seat time. Now, if Michael's not out of his seat, you put a 0.
Oh, okay, but I don't know what that's telling me.
Well, it's giving you an estimation of the amount of time that Michael is actually spending out of his seat during those intervals throughout the day.
And then you can use that data to track whether he's making improvements based on the intervention that we put in place or not.
And where would we write this?
You can just use a sticky note each day, but we can show you guys how to do that.
Yeah.
Obviously, this method will tend to overestimate behavior, but this isn't a problem because the behavior happens infrequently. The main thing is that it produces consistent data that allows us to track whether the student's behavior is changing. If the behavior of concern is high rate or it happens frequently, then we can use something called momentary interval recording. With this method, the teacher records a plus if the behavior is happening right at the end of the interval. Even if it was happening throughout the interval, if it is not happening when the interval ends, the teacher records a 0. Let's watch the student intervention team thinking through momentary interval recording with the teacher.
So thanks again for staying, Mr. Knott. We wanted to talk more about Alice because we need to develop a measure for her as well.
Okay, she's really a challenge. I can tell you right now that if we try to use the same measure for her as we developed for Michael, it's just going to show intervals almost 100% of the time because she's almost constantly talking.
And we're going to be implementing a new intervention for her using a differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior, so it's a good time to talk about that measure.
Well, again, I don't know that I can count how often she's talking because it is almost all the time.
We can still use a time-based system, but it would be a little bit more simple given her high rates of behavior.
Right, and so it's basically what you're doing with Michael already, except for the difference is, anytime that your timer goes off and she's talking, you put the plus.
Well, because I'm also tracking Michael, I don't know about doing this every 5 minutes.
And I can understand that, and that's okay, but we can make it like every 15 minutes because you will be doing it all period.
Won't this tend then to underestimate how often she's talking?
I mean, maybe, but it's okay because it'll be consistent.
And if she's doing it that often, it'll give us a good index for tracking her progress.
Okay, so when my timer goes off, if at that very moment she's talking, then I put a plus sign, and if she's not, then I put a 0?
Yep, so it doesn't matter at all what she's doing during the interval. You will just observe her and make that mark at the end of the interval.
We've looked at several different strategies for collecting progress monitoring data for behavior. Remember, selecting the right one is a two-step process. First, we need to determine the question we have about behavior. Then, we select the instrument, depending on how much time the observer has and how precise the measure needs to be. This decision tree is helpful in determining the best choice for measuring behavior. The first question gets at whether the behavior is opportunity-driven because there is only one option for this type of behavior. Student intervention teams can simply think through this decision tree, using their questions about behavior to find the most logical measurement strategy. Watch as the team uses the decision tree to identify logical strategies.
So we have 2 new intervention plans starting, and we need to think about how we're going to progress monitor.
The first one is Marjorie, and if you remember, she is just having trouble simply talking out and talking across the room at other students.
So it's not opportunity driven, so we just need to figure out what we want to know.
Well, I know she's being taught to self-manage, self-monitor, but what we want to know is how often is she talking out across the room? And so I think it's easy enough for teachers to tally how often that's happening, but the problem is if it's happening at a high frequency or a high rate, then it becomes harder. So maybe looking at the duration, the total time that she's talking across the room might be easier.
From what we have in our data and our records, it's not happening at a high rate.
Would the teacher be able to count though?
It looks like it's happening a few times per period.
So it kind of sounds like tallies make sense, and then we can get the teachers a clicker, and that way they can keep track of it easier. Who else needs a measurement strategy for progress monitoring?
The last one is Warren. He is a freshman that is currently receiving social skills instruction to decrease the amount of swearing he is doing at students, which appears to be without warning.
Okay, so it doesn't look to be opportunity driven. I guess we just need to figure out how often it happens.
Our records show that it is happening enough that it would be very difficult to count the amount of instances.
Okay, so we have a semi-high rate of instances, but not enough time to record every instance. So it seems like using the partial interval recording system makes sense here.
In summary, progress monitoring is simply the process we use to answer questions about whether our interventions are effective in terms of helping a given student meet his or her goals. To answer these questions requires frequent data over time so that trends can be identified and changes made as necessary. But as with any of the things we discuss under MTSS, the trick is to find the simplest method of gathering key pieces of information. This brings us to the end of the secondary version modules on multi-tier systems of support for behavior. The focus has been on how MTSS teams consider behavior at the school level, implement universal screening for at-risk behavior, facilitate additional collection of behavior data for interventions, consider the essential components of effective intervention, and engage in progress monitoring. Throughout, the purpose has been to illustrate how teams assist the school in creating positive learning environments and support systems for all. As we mentioned in Module 1, the MTSS process is cyclical, with screening leading to reteaching and adaptation of supports, which in turn leads to more screening. This process is continuous. It's never complete. But as Tier 1 systems are better aligned to student need, fewer students will be identified as at risk.